I honestly don't see why you're needed by this company. With a frustrated expression on his face, Keith, my boss at the company where I work, told me this. Keith, if anything, is superfluous. He frequently uses phrases like "you make too many mistakes" or "you're slow at your job" to disparage subordinates he doesn't like. He fired me regardless of the veracity of these allegations. Never again reveal your face here. He threw a fit and declared that I was dismissed after I retaliated a little for his terrible behavior. When I heard that, I quietly walked out of the room. He would never have anticipated what transpired, but he was presumably pleased to get rid of a boisterous subordinate. George is my name. 3 years ago, after graduating from college, I, a 25-year-old man with a sweet addiction, started working for a confectionery firm. Our business began as a modest suburban family-run store, but it progressively expanded and became a corporation. Sales have been soaring ever since. We have opened a number of stores, mostly in the city. Given the expansion of the internet in recent years, blogs and social media have probably had a significant influence. Since I was a young child, I have always liked sweets, especially cakes made in the Western style. Try the new recipe here. What are your thoughts? I loved baking cakes, in addition to enjoying eating them. After school, I would go straight to the kitchen, even before I finished my homework. I would occasionally create my own confections, and other times I would make pre-existing ones. George, don't you love baking so much? Yeah, give it a try. I would share my creations with my pals so they could sample it. I used to only make them because I enjoyed them, but at this point, I had a desire to use my candies to make people happy. Although my buddies served as my taste testers, I did felt a little terrible for them. He quickly took a portion of the tiny clear plastic packet I gave him and put it in his mouth. It tastes good. Every time I brought him candy, he seemed delighted. It seems that he also enjoyed sweets. It's been said that birds of a feather flock together, and even as a little child, I understood that to be true. However, it has a hint of sourness. Sour, huh? Perhaps I added too much sauce. The berry sauce was sandwiched between 2 layers of sponge cake. Maybe I used the wrong sauce, or maybe I used too much. I wrote down his comments in a little notepad so I could think about them later. I used it as a doodle book during school recess as well. It was an odd, simple notebook with notes about baking interspersed with drawings of robots and monsters. Aside from that, it tastes really good. Thank you. After making a fresh batch, I'll bring some more. After packing the notebook containing his comments into my bag, my companion and I hurried to the local park. I wasn't caged up indoors all the time just because I love baking. Like any other child, I also like to run about and play outside. In retrospect, I can say that my early years were enjoyable, creative, and energetic. My mom in particular was particularly concerned about my pastime, though. Are you baking again, George? Indeed. I developed a brand new recipe. As usual, I was in the kitchen preparing sweets one day after school when my mother struck up a conversation with me. Don't you think you and your friends should play outside more often? I'll take my friends to the park after I'm finished. When I responded to her query, I meant that she didn't need to worry. Nevertheless, she muttered, with a worried expression. It was easy to assume that she wasn't persuaded, but I continued working with my back to the wall because I was occupied. All right, but since you're a boy, you ought to play outside more. All right, so what is the connection between gender and baking? I wanted to bake, so I did. I refused to allow anyone to get in the way of it. Every time I answered this question, I did so in a way that was a little defiant. As I carried this mindset throughout high school, my mother finally stopped bringing it up. After witnessing my true enjoyment, she most likely come to terms with it, or perhaps she simply gave up. In any case, I was happy as long as I could continue baking the way I wanted to. George, how is your college coursework going? On a Saturday morning, I was scrubbing the dishes and baking some sweets when my dad came over and inquired. Well, everything is going fine. All right. Just make sure you complete your college education. I am aware that my father has always been stern and has insisted that I prioritize both my studies and athletics. He never once instructed me to stop baking, which made me think he could be the traditional, stubborn kind. In fact, there were moments when I thought he was suddenly on my side. I'd eventually completed my college education without needing to take a gap year or repeat a year. Here, I used my passion for baking to my advantage and was hired by the confectionery firm I currently work for. I started off working at one of the stores, but I was moved to the head office last summer, where I currently work in the accounting division. Hold on, this is weird. The figures don't add up. Since I'm the kind of person who works best on my feet, spending all day at a computer doing math is really difficult for me. I've only had time to bake on the weekends since I started this job. Another cause of stress for me has been the significant cutback in the amount of time I spend on my pastime. One more thing. I and everyone else in the accounting department are always stressed out by a certain someone. Hey George, there were errors in the document you created once more. Double check your work before you submit it, yelled Keith, my supervisor, just now. It's me who receives the reprimands for these errors. I'm sorry. Are you able to identify the errors? I'll check it over and submit it again. Keith responded to my question by saying, Come on. Don't go around asking people about it. Look for it on your own. You realize you're not a child. With his hands on his hips and a half smile of incredulity, he stated this. He could simply tell me if he knows there are errors, but he chooses not to. He likes this power play, of course. Even though he only ever smokes or stamps papers, he is always criticizing his coworkers for small errors. I apologize. By the end of the day, I will locate it. He gets upset if we disagree, so the accounting department coworkers keep quiet. Keith takes advantage of that to become even more controlling. Everyone now experiences chronic stress as a result of this destructive cycle. Errors, where might they be? I checked to be sure Keith was gone, then muttered to myself as I looked for the errors he had pointed out. He would have another tantrum if I didn't put down what I was doing and concentrate on this. In this setting, it had become our responsibility as subordinates to keep him happy, and that had become our main concern. We would be depressed if we didn't at least whisper grumbles to ourselves. The mood in the accounting department was at its worst as a result. Although the material appeared to be acceptable, Keith's approval stamp was clearly visible on the PDF he returned. Only because Keith himself had examined the material should the stamp have been present. Is that a typo? After giving it some thought, I proofread the document. Despite going over it multiple times, nothing appeared to be incorrect. Oh, we're at it once more. This was not the first time such an incident has occurred. He wouldn't say what the error was, and once it was found, there wouldn't be anything wrong to find. It was a situation that had happened several times previously. Keith was engaging in what was essentially falsification. Well, such a prickly fellow. I had a senior colleague look it over just to be sure, but once more, there were no errors. I returned it to Keith exactly as it was, with no modifications. He causes needless suffering to his subordinates in this way. He discloses trivial or even non-existent errors to his superiors and claims credit for fixing them. To put it another way, his work consists entirely on pointing fingers and fabricating accomplishments. Documents had recently been changed and portions of data erased. Some have attempted to obtain proof and inform the superiors about him, but they appeared hesitant out of concern for reprisals. I continued to work as hard as I could under such circumstances. Our accounting department, which was in charge of creating the financial reports, was in a panic as the shareholders' meeting drew near. Because of this, the environment was more tense than usual, and everyone's threshold for rage was considerably lower than it was for Keith, who was carefree. We won't make it again, I guess. In a few cases, the numbers simply didn't add up, regardless of how many times I recalculated. There was a $50,000 sum that could not be explained. If my memory serves me well, the project paperwork for this project bore the approval seals of both George and Keith. This meant that Keith and I were in charge of the project, but I hadn't really done anything of it. I found it odd because he usually assigned me all of the work, But I never imagined Keith was in charge of this project, right? I went over to Keith after printing off the materials I needed to explain. What are you looking for? He glared at me with an irritated expression. The figures don't add up, no matter how many times I recalculate. Additionally, we're discussing a substantial amount of $50,000. I'd assumed you would know something, but I even questioned my senior accounting department colleagues. Keith appeared to get my point as he quickly perused the stapled pages. He wrinkled his brows for a time, then tossed the papers back on the desk. I'm not sure whether you have time for this. Simply finish your assignment. In my mind, I quietly cursed him because I believed that was what he ought to be doing. However, we can't disregard a $50,000 mystery. Stop talking. It's either a calculating error or a misunderstanding on your part. He refused to look into it further and kept to that stance regardless of what I said. It's extremely suspicious when someone is thus obstinately obstructive. I said in a low voice, "All right, fine," and went back to my desk. I was aware that we were currently overworked, but because Keith was not going to take any action, I made the subtle decision to look into the situation myself. The possibility that Keith was embezzling money was becoming clear. I gathered the required paperwork once more and returned to his desk. Are you persistent, Keith? This time, what is it? As if to suggest, figure out why I'm here yourself. I handed him the paperwork in silence. I informed you that you made a calculation error. Where is the error exactly? Please draw attention to it. My blunt inquiry caught Keith off guard, and he became increasingly agitated. On the other hand, I maintained my composure and kept answering firmly. Keith refused to acknowledge anything in spite of all of this proof. Therefore, if you're saying that there's an error, kindly point it out to me. Or is this merely a charge? You little. His leg bounced uneasily, and he appeared annoyed. I guess he was growing tired of my asking the same questions over and over. You're slow at your job, to start. That isn't pertinent at the moment, is it? You make too many errors. In particular, where are the errors? Point them out, please. I saw a drop of perspiration trickle down Keith's brow. He was speaking incoherently more and more. Even with the facts I had, it was a gamble, but it appeared that I was correct. To be honest, I fail to see why you are needed by this company. As he spoke, Keith swallowed his rage and attempted a bitter smile, but I simply replied, "What a coincidence. I have the same sentiments. I also fail to see why the organization needs you." You little. What did you say? At what I said, Keith erupted in anger. His smirk soon gave way to a look of rage as he yelled so loudly that his voice could be heard throughout the workplace. You've been fired. Never again reveal your face here. The abrupt announcement of my termination caught me off guard. He went farther than I thought he would. He continued to spit forth a barrage of insults while I stood there wide-eyed, even in his rage. Keith had gone absolutely crazy and was now a ferocious beast. I left the workplace after apologizing to my senior colleagues for my inability to defuse the situation. I pulled out my phone and called someone as I was walking down the corridor. Hey, I want you to proceed with that issue we talked about earlier. The other end's voice was one of satisfaction. Yes, that's all. Thank you. After hanging up, I returned it to my pocket. I couldn't help but smile as I stood in the dark corridor. As planned, the shareholders' meeting took place a few days later. I hadn't shown up in the accounting department since I was fired, but it appeared that the preparations were finished on schedule. I surprisingly ran into Keith as I walked inside the melancholy location. Oh, hi there. You're here, but why? This isn't where you belong. What brought you here? Go now. As soon as he saw me, he began insulting me, but today I didn't bother to answer. I simply laughed casually and dismissed him. Keith, you're speaking too loudly. There stood a tall, graying-haired man. Scott was returning today after spending the last few weeks in the hospital for medical testing. He was the department head and my boss, as well as Keith's. You're right. I said, I was fired. Scott, I already fired this guy. Keep quiet, I said. Scott interrupted Keith, who flinched back, his expression sad. but he kept glaring at me, so it was obvious he still didn't like that I was here. It's almost time now. Should we leave? Yes, I said, and Scott and I made our way to the best seats in the house, which were set aside for the executives and significant stockholders. Why are you sitting there, George? Are you even aware of who owns the seat? Keith continued to yell after being repeatedly warned to stop. Keith, don't you know? The introductory remarks began as Scott, apparently impatient, proceeded to explain. Scott paused his speech and looked at the presenter. I did as he said. At last, even Keith sat down and grudgingly took a seat. Mr. Kelly, the president, stepped up to the stage and started discussing the company's current state, management, and future goals. I could feel Keith's eyes on me all the time during the process. He appeared to have turned pallid. The reports end there. The question and answer period will now begin. Please raise your hand if you have any queries. No hands were raised. The stockholders were too busy going over their materials. Yet, this is my chance. Excuse me, may I ask a question? I raised my hand and looked straight at Mr. Kelly, having previously prepared my questions. I caught a glimpse of Keith squirming out of the corner of my eye. Go ahead. I'm grateful. Concerning the financial statements of the business. Here, I went forward and gave Mr. Kelly the materials. These were the resources I had gathered while looking into Keith. According to this document, there appeared to be approximately $50,000 in unaccounted for expenses. Could you elaborate on the purpose of this money? I appreciate your inquiry. Mr. Kelly turned to Keith and said, I will have Keith, the head of the accounting department, respond to this. Keith jumped to his feet, shaky, and yelled, Why is someone who was dismissed asking questions like this? Furthermore, why are you seated there at all? Keith was making a spectacle rather than responding to the question, possibly because his wrongdoing had been revealed at the shareholders' meeting. A person with your level of incompetence has no place here. You don't belong here. I told you to go. Like that day, Keith had lost all self-control. Normally polite, Scott loudly stepped in to stop him. Keith remained still for a single word, possibly taken aback by his customary manner. It is quite reasonable for him to be present at the shareholders' meeting on this side, no less. Nothing is wrong with it. Keith's expression became blank in bewilderment as he listened to Scott's statements. He fidgeted awkwardly with shame, as if he had regained some of his composure. Keith, take a look at this. Having said that, I produced a copy of a document, a proxy statement, to Keith. When Keith understood what it meant, he started to shake once more. He must have realized who he had betrayed and the consequences. According to the proxy statement, his older brother owns over 60% of the shares, making him the primary shareholder. On his behalf, he is attending. Yes, this was a very unpleasant truth for Keith, and he fell back in his chair when he heard it. He uttered only barely audible moans, as if unable to speak. This company's president is my father, Richard Kelly. Earlier, he was the one on stage telling the stockholders what was going on. My father assumed control after my grandfather, the founder, passed away. The biggest stockholder, my older brother Samuel, is employed in a totally unrelated field to confectionery. What I'm going to inherit is the cake shop. My brother was a senior in high school while I was in second grade. My father started talking to him about the future about the time he was accepted to college. Yes, it's still a long way off, but I'd like to entrust it to you as the eldest son. My brother, obviously distressed by my father's severe tone, scratched the back of his head. Playing loudly with a dual-screen square handheld game console next to them, I was just 8 years old at the time and didn't understand the scenario. Dad, you know I'm not really a fan of cakes, right? My brother had less of a sweet tooth, which was a sharp contrast to my love of baking and sweets. In hindsight, expecting him to take over a bakery shop seemed rather harsh. Yes, your mother informed me. Then spare me, please. I won't be able to dedicate myself to running a store that sells something I dislike. Yes, it is accurate. However, the store was still a little family-owned enterprise at the time. Sales, however, were rising steadily. Making tasty and reasonably priced candies that even young children could purchase with their pocket money was the shop's credo. This strategy had been sufficiently well-liked locally to be highlighted in local publications. My brother made the decision to invest in the store and form it as a corporation when I was a high school student. He decided to do that rather than take over the company. Sales of the pastries have increased even further since then. Our current position is the result of the company's steady growth. Hey, my brother is expecting his second child soon and can't leave his wife's side, which is why I'm here on his behalf. Keith's face paled even more when I told him why I was there. He remained sitting and gestured at me with a quivering finger. But the most significant one is your brother. It doesn't alter the fact that the business doesn't need you. What are you saying, Keith? Once again losing his temper, Keith received a stern reprimand from Scott. Keith's countenance, which I had seen on numerous occasions, became blank. He's the second son of Mr. Kelly and the next president of this company. What? It was unavoidable, yet it had become an unexpected announcement. As Scott said, it's still some time away, but I am set to take over from my father as president. The announcement that I would be taking over as vice president was meant to be made during the shareholders' meeting, but things have gone awry. Not at all. You, the incoming president? Keith appeared to lose focus as he heard Scott's statements. He didn't want to believe it, or rather, he couldn't believe it. How could he simply accept that the president's son was the subordinate he had worked so hard to discredit? In contrast to my brother, who disliked sweets, I enjoyed creating and eating them. I grew up eating cakes from the shop, so I was well aware of how good they were. My goal was for this taste to become even more popular nationwide. That's how I started thinking at one point. In order to produce sweets that could be purchased with pocket money, I not only manufactured pre-made cakes, but also developed my own recipes. I concentrated on cutting expenses as much as I could. How to make them appear as nice as they tasted was the difficult part. Beyond appearances, creating new creations brought me a lot of satisfaction. The procedure seemed almost like a puzzle game when these two guidelines were kept in mind. In addition to cutting expenses, I also wanted to make sure the ingredients were safe. It was difficult to source ingredients at a low cost while maintaining excellent quality, but we were able to do so because of our established connections with nearby farms and the new alliances we formed. The company grew as a result of these efforts. For me, it was crucial to value this business, which had developed from the cake shop my grandpa had started. I wanted to closely monitor the money flow because of this. Since I was already slated to become vice president, I was in the accounting division. I believe it was the right decision even if my original goal was different because I ended up exposing someone like Keith. We will now go on to the Q&A. The results of the study into this issue will be presented by George, the vice president. The shareholders' meeting continued after my father's remarks. Yes, Keith embezzled the $50,000 that couldn't be explained, I declared. The room was alive with sound as I spoke. The man at the heart of the dispute, Keith, remained hunched over in silence. He conspired to fabricate invoices with a supplier. Company funds were used to pay these invoices, and the supplier received a portion of the earnings. When we carefully examined the invoices, we discovered that Keith's approval stamp appeared on bills for goods that were never delivered. The supplier's representative acknowledged the misconduct when questioned. In order to prevent Keith and the other persons involved from escaping, my father and I agreed to report the damage to the police on the company's behalf. In front of the board members and shareholders, I revealed Keith's wrongdoing. With a dejected expression, he fell to his knees as everything became clear. I heard, "This is the police," at that very moment. "Keith, you have an arrest warrant." Keith was taken away by the police officers who had come at the shareholders' meeting. He allowed himself to be led away without protest. My father and I bowed to the stockholders a few minutes after the room had subsided. We were expressing regret for an employee's misbehavior. To formally look into the degree of the damages, we plan to collaborate closely with the police. The goal is to get Keith to pay back as much of the losses as he can, even though not all of them may be recouped. George was the first to discover the scam. I think he is qualified to lead this organization as vice president and then president because of his unwavering commitment to enforcing the law. The room erupted in cheers when Mr. Kelly said this. Being accepted instead of disliked was comforting. Let's listen to the new vice president's speech now. Although I did approach the microphone, however, I didn't feel anxious. Giving a speech didn't feel all that frightening, maybe because I had been much more nervous dealing with Keith. My grandfather started this business as a cake shop. It was soon after the war, when food was in low supply and the wounds of the conflict were still evident. My grandfather started baking sweet cakes to lift the spirits of the kids when he noticed their grins waning. He gained experience and expertise in cake decorating as the number of kids visiting for goodies steadily grew. It all began when he used his skills to open a tiny stall. My father, the current president, inherited my grandfather's wish to preserve the children's smiles with cakes, and I now wish to continue that tradition with him. The environment surrounding children and the need for sweets have undergone tremendous shift during the post-war era. The state of the economy has changed, and patterns have emerged. However, there is one thing that hasn't changed: children's smiles when they eat sweets. I want to make sure that priceless joy never fades. I need the help of all of our workers and shareholders to do this. The crowd erupted in cheers once more as I bowed and concluded my remarks. My father gave me a really emotional look and said, "George, you've grown up so well." I then quit the accounting division and started working mostly as my father's assistant at meetings, on business travels, and when he wanted to greet people. Busy days continued, with a lot of running around. Despite everything, I always made sure to monitor the company's internal operations. I was often in the product development division. This feels less like work and more like a continuation of my previous pastime. It tastes good, but maybe a little too sour. I eventually moved to the side of judging other people's cakes. Children may find it unpleasant if the sourness is too intense. Although I appreciate the request, I do feel a little alone. Even asking my dad if I can work in the development department more often is something I'm considering. This size could present a choking hazard. Could you perhaps add some holes or make it smaller? I was concerned that my incessant criticism could irritate people, but the development department staff assured me that it was beneficial. I've known a few people in this department since I was a young child. Fortunately, everyone trusted my opinions, maybe because I've been eating the company's pastries since I was a child. Are you only here to taste the cakes, George? I was mocked by Edward, the development department director, who has known me since I was a young child. Obviously not. I'm here to observe the progress of the development project. Everything is fine. Additionally, your exact counsel is always quite beneficial. Knowing that I wasn't merely circling about was a relief. I used to work in the accounting department, and I occasionally showed my face there as well. The department head is now one of my seniors who always looked out for me. Under Scott's tutelage, he appears to be settling into his new role. He'll likely succeed even in this new managerial role because he's good at taking care of others. Oh, Mr. Kelly, good afternoon. Good afternoon, indeed. The accounting section has a more upbeat vibe than it did previously. It's most likely because the problematic person who threw tantrums, made up mistakes, and tossed work on others is no longer there. Since then, working has been considerably simpler. Above all, we don't get yelled at, and we can communicate with our managers more readily. The office erupted in laughter when one of the coworkers mentioned that. Yes, it's a positive result if they can now laugh about what happened in the past. Sincerely, I'm relieved they weren't traumatized. I was happy that I hadn't made a bad choice. During a break on another day, I decided to stop by one of our stores. Originally a tiny cabin that my grandfather constructed by hand, this was our first store and has undergone multiple renovations. Hello. A bell rang and a parent and child stepped through the manual door. A young child, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, appeared to be thrilled by the pastries. More customers soon arrived. As the kids selected which cakes to purchase, they were all grinning broadly. Some of them filled their small baskets with so many cakes that they appeared to be about to overflow. Although it was wonderful to watch, I questioned whether their mothers would discipline them for grabbing so many. Funny, this reminds me of the past. We can purchase as many cakes as we choose now that we are grown-ups. They refer to that as a shopping binge. The exhilaration of being asked to choose only one favorite dessert, whether it was the same cake I always had or the risk of trying something else, was what I enjoyed most though. I was the kind of person who was always up for trying something new. Finding different kinds of cakes was like embarking on a true journey. The children who are currently selecting cakes in the supermarket are undoubtedly experiencing the same thrill. There are a lot of smiles here because of this. It's time to return to work and give it my all then. My goal is to preserve those smiles and pass them on to the following generation. Keeping that in mind, I started working on my next assignment.